We all set? Perfect. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the weekly seminar series here at the Daedalus Institute for Global Health Research. My name is Dr. James Orzinski. I'm the director of the Daedalus Institute for Global Health Research. And today we have two outstanding professors who are going to be leading a seminar discussion presentation on pandemic urbanism, infectious diseases on a planet of cities. Before we get to that, where I'll give a brief introduction of both of our seminar leaders, I'd like to begin our seminar by acknowledging the indigenous land that we are on. And as this is a virtual event or seminar, many guests are on different territories, so please do take a moment to give thanks and respect to the land on which you are currently physically located on. And today I'm here at York University at the Keele campus in Toronto, and this is situated on the traditional territorial area known as Takaranto, and we acknowledge its current treaty holders, which are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We also acknowledge this as the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and of course the Métis. And this territory is subject to of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and this is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And so with that land acknowledgement, I'd like to introduce briefly our two speakers, our seminar leaders. One is Haris Ali, who's here in person. And Haris is a colleague and I guess I can even say now a friend. And a sociologist.
Very close.
Is a sociologist here at York, and he teaches in the areas of environmental sociology, disaster and emergency management, social theory, and environmental health. And his research focuses on how the interplay of social, political, and environmental factors promote the emergence of disease outbreaks in very particular ways, and also promote the emergence of environmental disasters in very particular ways. And Haris has conducted many studies, almost all based on extensive actual physical fieldwork on different types of infectious disease outbreaks around the world. And these have included E. Coli here in Ontario, in Walkerton, tuberculosis among homeless people here in Toronto, community-based responses to Ebola in Liberia and Sierra Leone and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and many other studies that he's engaged in. He has a long list of publications, and I'm just going to highlight a couple, but his longtime research colleague, and dare I say friend, is Roger Kyle, and they have produced many just great papers and books together, focused on network disease, emerging infections in the global city is a book that they've recently produced, and that was recognized by the Globe and Mail as actually one of the top 10 books that offer lessons from past pandemics. And I'd just, again, also like to just briefly introduce Roger, also a colleague and I think, dare I say, friend, who's a professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change here at York. His research focuses on global urban political ecology, suburbanization, cities, and infectious disease, and infrastructure and regional governance. He's one of the leading thinkers on urbanization, and his publications are many, but I'll just highlight Suburban Planet, published in 2018 by Polity Press, and then After Suburbia, published with Fulong Wu at the University of Toronto Press just last year, and Turning Up the Heat, Urban Political Ecology for a Climate Emergency, published with, co-authored, I think, with Maria Keika and Tate Mandler and Yanis Zanis, I believe is the right pronunciation. And Roger was the director of the Cities Institute here at York and led really a transformative approach to thinking about cities, and is currently deeply engaged in many different research projects, some of which I have the privilege of being affiliated with. And for both Harris and myself, Roger, it is for me, it has been one of the highlights actually of my time here at York, is working with both Roger and Harris on various ideas and various research proposals. And with that, Harris and Roger are going to discuss their recent book, which they co-authored with Crichton Connolly, and the book is titled Pandemic Urbanism. The book, you have a copy. Where is it there? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's perfect. There it is. Somebody's holding it up. Beautiful blue cover. I just received it a couple weeks back. I've glanced through it. It is absolutely fantastic, and it's at the top of my reading pile. So I'm really excited about it. The book takes a multidisciplinary theoretical approach to understanding pandemics. It looks at the historical context of recent infectious disease events and how they have transformed the urban social fabric. They highlight, both Harris and Roger highlight the important role played by social or socio-ecological processes that are associated with global urban periphery, as they describe it. I won't go into any more details. I'll leave it to them to give us an overview of what they have produced in the book. And I will just remind before we begin, Harris and Roger, that it's a 1-hour seminar. It'll end at 2:00. We'll start with a 30-minute presentation by Harris and Roger, and we'll have about a 20-minute Q&A and hopefully discussion. And we're going to wrap up tightly at about 5 to 2. Please note the seminar is being recorded. Mute your microphone. There's many people online, but please do mute your microphone unless you're asking a question or engaging in discussion. And please also, if you can, if you're online, use the raise your hand function at the bottom of your bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And once Roger and Harris have finished their presentation, I would really encourage people to turn on your camera so we can see your face. It actually enables just slightly better kind of interaction when we have so many people present virtually. So with that, I'm going to turn over to you, Harris and Roger, and welcome.
Okay, thank you, James, for that introduction, and also to your institute to the presentation for Roger to speak on this topic, Pandemic Urbanism, our book, Infectious on a Planet of Cities. So I will jump right in. Okay, thanks everyone for coming. I'll begin with just giving a short preview of the first couple of topics that are on the outline, and then I'll hand it over to Roger to speak about what's called the post-pandemic city, what lies ahead. Now, the overall sort of general research question for our book was this one. With an emphasis on the socio-spatial logic and dynamics involved, we explored a question of how urbanization processes influence the emergence, spread, and response to infectious disease. So it's a very general and deceivingly simple sort of question. But in addressing it, we'll see that we bring in a lot of stuff, and it's a quite complex answer involving many disciplines, as we'll see, and many perspectives from academia and policy and beyond. Okay? So outline of the talk, first I'll give some introductory remarks and background to the topic. In that I'll talk about certain concepts like microbial traffic, extended urbanization, and planetary urbanism. And then we'll focus on some empirical case studies that illustrate certain principles involved in understanding infectious disease outbreaks, at the dawn of this century to the COVID pandemic that just happened or that we're still in. And then, as I said, Roger will talk about the post-pandemic city. Okay. So in terms of background and introduction, our guiding approach is based on this idea of socio-spatial logic. We're focusing on that. And to sort of analyze the socio-spatial logic behind a disease outbreak, we sort of adopt the notion of microbial traffic and how this is affected by extended and planetary urbanization. So we use three sort of concepts already: microbial traffic, extended, and planetary urbanization. So let's just, for being on the same page, go over this very briefly, each of these concepts. Microbial traffic, this is a geographic concept, I guess, ultimately, because it looks at time and space and the diffusion of disease through time and space. And it has various dimensions associated with it. The first is about cross-species transfer. Of course, as you know, there are viral reservoirs out there, and somehow the virus or the pathogen has to get into the human being. Sometimes it goes through an intermediate animal and so on. So, if you're looking at the traffic, the movement through space and time, you have to consider cross-species transfer. Spatial diffusion, obviously, the virus gets transmitted through space and, for that matter, time. Right? Pathogenic evolution. As you know, as we're dealing with the pandemic and the different variants, the different strains, all this has to do with the evolution of the pathogen, how the pathogen changes, evolves, and adapts to the environment so that it becomes a new strain, right? Sometimes the strains of the virus don't affect the human being, they affect only animals, but then they change, then they affect human beings. All the time, these viruses are changing through, the technical processes of antigenic shift and so on, antigenic drift, right? But, I'm not going to get into those here. Suffice to say that these changes allow the virus to adapt and move on to other environments, okay? Now, key for us, though, is the last dimension of microbial traffic, and it's the one I'll emphasize the most in this talk: changes in the human-environment relations. And, the sort of classical epidemiological triad, which people use to describe an outbreak, says that there has to be a coincidence in time and space, or a convergence of agent, host, in a conducive environment, And most of the time, this idea of conducive environment focuses on the physical environment or biophysical environment, but we extend this idea to look at the social, political, and economic environment and how that facilitates disease spread, right? So, Roger and I have, studied this now close to 2 decades, and, during the 2003 SARS outbreak, we came across these cartoons in the newspaper, and this was 20 years ago. But since that time, there's been a huge onslaught of what are called new and emerging diseases. And all of them just off the top of your head. COVID, MERS, hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, Ebola, HIV, AIDS, Lyme disease, Clostridium difficile, antibiotic resistant tuberculosis, right? The list goes on and on and on, right? What was that? Zika virus, right? Just in the last quarter century, right? Something is going on, and the thing is, I'm not going to get into it here, but when there's a significant change in the relationship between human being and an environment, you get these sort of onslaught of diseases coming up. So, for example, when people went to agricultural society, away from hunting and gathering, people went to livestock and that sort of way of living, that led to a whole onslaught of diseases, many of which we're still contending with today, Anyway, so that's something to bear in mind. So that's one dimension about the microbial traffic. Now, Henri Lefebvre was a famous urban sociologist. He wrote about the urban revolution, and in that he was talking about how the urban's reach has extended to many areas that are not conventionally thought of as being associated with the city core. In other words, we're talking about how the urban has an influence and penetration on those areas that are at the periphery of the urban core, okay? And, oftentimes in the periphery of the urban core are where many people work, for example, in factories, right, at the periphery of the city, or slaughterhouses, right, airports, often at the periphery of the city, oil development that occurs there, landfill sites. Oftentimes these are out of sight, out of mind places, not the center of focus. Center of focus tends to be on the city center. where all the so-called, stuff is going on. Now, this peripheral extended urbanization that we're referring to also happens in other areas outside the city, like the First Nations reserves, right? And they had their own problems, which, we can't get into here, but also like certain areas that are on the outer core of the city core, outer center of the city core, right? And then, of course, like where the migrant workers work, like in Niagara, right? These are outside the city too, in the peripheral areas, and of course, informal settlements. And as you know, this is the urbanization century. More than half the world's population lives in cities, but it's not just cities. It's on the outside of the cities, like in the informal settlements that often form on the undesired land on the periphery of the urban core. And so what we're saying is that we need to focus on these areas, especially for disease spread, and we'll see why in a second, and the book gets into that. Planetary urbanism, this pervasiveness of urbanism that we're talking about, is now a worldwide phenomenon. Okay, the worldwide spread, reach, and influence of urban centers to the peripheral areas is today a global phenomenon. It's all over the world. Okay? And you intuitively know that, I think. Right? Many of us have had the luxury of traveling, and we see this occurring. So understanding infectious disease epidemics in terms of three interrelated types of urbanizing processes. Okay? The emergence of the global city system. Okay? Another urbanization process is all this sort of what's going on in the global south with the development of huge informal settlements in the megacities and the so-called slum areas. Right? That's another huge urban development process. And what we just were referring to, extended urbanization as a general phenomenon, the suburbs and the places outside of the city. Okay? So let's look at the first situation, which is the emergence of the global city system. This was important in the microbial traffic of SARS. Okay? Now this is a map of what are called the global cities in the world. Many of them, of course, you're familiar with. The researchers tend to put these into certain classification according to their influence. So obviously, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, London, Milan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, right? Paris, very important global cities, right? And then you have a sort of secondary tier of cities, right, that are important too, like Toronto, Mexico City, and so on, and a tertiary of global cities, or gamma world cities, as they're called. Now, what do you mean influence then? Well, these cities, these global cities, are sort of the command and control post of the global economy. They talk about globalization, and there's different ways you can talk about globalization, and one of them is economic globalization. And these global cities play an important role in economic globalization. You see, many of the headquarters of corporations are in these cities, but more importantly, okay, it's about the network flow that's connecting these global cities together. And it's a flow of people, of natural resources, of information, of capital, labor, and of course, microbes and pathogens, right? So when we looked at SARS, we saw that there was a flow of that coronavirus between Hong Kong, Singapore, and Toronto. And we're looking at those connections in the microbial traffic. Okay? And one of the things we wrote about, and it's also covered in this book a little bit, is how the nature of cities these days has changed. That the cities in the olden days had this sort of impenetrable boundary. In the olden days, medieval times, they had physically a wall around them, right? But these days, you can say, no, it's not like that. You have all these flows between cities coming, 24-hour economy, all this sort of stuff. And so the boundaries between cities, theoretically speaking, isn't as set out as once was the case before. And that has implications for disease spread. One of the interesting things, you all learn about your neoliberalism and your studies and things like that, right? And neoliberalism encourages free trade. It wants to get rid of borders. But at the same time, there's this idea of putting up borders to keep people out. You see this especially now with the discussions over the migration crisis, refugee crisis, and all this sort of stuff, right? So there's interesting tensions going on there too. The other thing about cities, and global cities in particular, and microbial traffic, is how the virus can spread according to the built environment. This is Amoy Gardens, Hong Kong, where there was an outbreak in this apartment complex. So what was interesting is what happened spatially was that you see this unit here, there may have been a case of SARS there. Then right underneath it, there was a case of SARS. Right underneath it, there was a case of SARS. All in this vertical line, there were cases of SARS. So what was happening is it had to deal with the architecture of this building and this U-pipe in particular. You know, usually this U-pipe is filled with water, and this serves as a barrier, right? Prevents entry of odors, vectors, and so on. And in Europe and Asia, oftentimes you have these outlets, you know, for water, and they drain through things. Anyway, contaminated water, this is contaminated with the SARS coronavirus. The person had, like, you know, the diarrhea, and the dirty water was washed into this sort of pipe, and this water wasn't in the U-shaped pipe, and it allowed the virus to get into the vertical pipe, and it spread unit below unit below unit through this way, because of this simple thing, no water being, you know, you see these in the bottom of the sink, right? So this architecture contributes to the microbial traffic for sure. Okay. Now, another situation, we talked about what was happening in the global south and urbanization, especially of young people moving towards cities, and the demographics changing in the areas, especially the proliferation of informal settlements, right? This played a very important role in the spread of Ebola, okay? Previously to 2014, 2016, Ebola occurred in sort of isolated location in rural and remote sites, okay? You see, the effect of that is it allows the disease spread to be constrained and limited. In other words, I don't like to use this expression, but the virus burns itself out. It can't get more hosts, right? But something different happened with 2014, 2016. Ebola found its way into major cities in West Africa, leading to the highest casualty rate from that disease of over 11,000, right, in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, okay, where Roger and I have done studies with our partner Masoka Fala and Joseph McCarthy, okay. Now, but why this is difficult? This is, I would say, different. Because previously, as was mentioned, the outbreaks were occurring in sort of Central Africa, in Eastern Africa. This was happening in West Africa, and it was happening in cities, right? So we examined what was going on, and we're looking at the migration patterns of people, okay, as they came into the informal settlements. But it was more than people just coming into the informal settlements. You see, in Africa, you know, you have a lot of people moving back and forth, high mobility area, because people live in rural villages. They come to the city to visit their relatives, maybe to work sometime, make some money, then go back to the village. There's all this sort of movement, right, that goes on all the time. It's part of life, right? And you know, in a way, a nice part of life to keep up with your families. But it has implications for disease spread, right? And you see that when you compare Ebola to COVID. You see? So people, you know, from the rural villages where Ebola first took hold would come to visit their relatives and stay with them and work for a while in the city like Monrovia. And oftentimes, not always, but most of the time, they would stay in these informal settlement areas. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation, right? You know how these slum areas are, right? They're not very nice areas. So the disease would spread from the rural area to the informal settlement. Now here's the thing, there's a connection between different social classes. This is the rich area of the capital of Liberia, Monrovia, right? You know, the hotels are there and all this sort of thing. And the people who live here employ gardeners, security staff, domestic workers for elderly and child care, drivers, maids, all this sort of stuff. And they come from here. So they come from here, they go here to work, and then the disease spreads from here to here. Now, COVID was different, right? COVID was spread through international travelers who were living here, who had the money to go for educational purposes, business trips, conferences, and then get the disease and come back here, where they would expose their workers, oftentimes people who helped take care of them, who would then go back to the informal settlement. And the disease spread from here to here, hence the direction of the COVID. So we're looking at the microbial traffic of the disease and urbanization. Okay. Now, you look at how COVID spread in the city of Toronto. How do I get rid of this? Thank you. Look, this is the COVID rates. Where are the areas that are most affected? Are they in the city core? No, they're in the peripheral areas of the city, particularly here. This area in Brampton, L6P area code, the highest rate of COVID in all of Canada. Toronto and Ottawa are second behind that area, right? And also up here. Okay, this is the peripheries we're talking about, starting to talk about with extended urbanization. Here is some statistics. Communities with the 5 lowest rates of COVID infection. Okay, lowest COVID rate. What is the percentage of the Black people? 2%, Beaches, East Danforth, 6%, 1%, 4% Black people, 2% Black. Lowest COVID rates, right? So then you look here, communities with the top 5 highest COVID rates. What is the percentage of Black people? 19%, 32%, 24%, 33%, 11%. Quite different from the single digits here, right? And, various studies have shown as the percentage of Black people goes up, the number of COVID rates go up. The number of people infected with the COVID go up, right? Now, if we look at the L6P area code in Brampton that I was referring to, in the peripheral area, okay, what do we have in that peripheral area? You have slaughterhouses, Maple Lodge Farms, where there's an outbreak amongst limousine taxi drivers, right? Outbreak amongst the people who live in large homes with multiple families, generations, right? And this is where the racism and prejudice came, right? It's not a fault of the people. These people were the essential workers. They were the ones who were driving people where they needed to be. They were providing the food. They were making sure the Amazon fulfillment center was getting other people their stuff. And yet they're being blamed. Oh, these South Asian people, they live like that, all this sort of thing, right? There was racism during the pandemic, of course. This is an Amazon fulfillment center in Brampton, L6P. It had to be closed down because of an outbreak, right? The other thing is, look, many in this area, Punjabi background, many truck drivers in this area. And Brampton, this peripheral area, is connected to the 400 series of highways, and the airport, which is very important logistically to get stuff moving around the country and to the United States, right? In the peripheral area, where a lot of the gaze is not. But these peripheral areas were very successful in fighting COVID because of various drop-in clinics, mobile clinics, people who go door-to-door knocking on people, social media campaigns. So it shouldn't be that all hope is lost. These areas were very, successful in combating COVID because of community-based programs. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Roger now. Can you stop share and then get Roger, please? And then, yeah.
Yeah, so thanks, Harris. And thanks, James, and everybody at Daudelet for the invitation and for the introduction. We're very happy. When we made this particular date, March 8th, I thought it would never come because it was so far in the future, but things catch up with one. I want to apologize to those of you who are in the room that I can't be with you, but I did break my ankle 3 weeks ago today. And I'm still sort of not the most mobile person in the world. So I'm coming to you from home remotely, as we're all used to do. So one of the things I wanted to do is to talk a little bit about our final chapter. And when you write a book like this, as we did, and we wanted to actually get this book out earlier, and then as academic publishing processes go, it always goes through review and so on and so on. So in a way, I was happy that it was all delayed a little bit, and we could reflect a little more, and that didn't have to work under pressure as much. But the pressure was still there because we were writing, and we were writing with our friend Creighton, who is at the other end of the world in Hong Kong. We were writing in times of high uncertainty, but the material that Harris covered, we can now say is fairly clearly in the past, and we have the data, and so most of the chapters in the book are about the knowledge that we have about these diseases and their relationship to those different kinds of urbanization processes that Harris has outlined. But the final chapter had to be a bit speculative. So we needed to, stick our neck out and say, what could be? How can we, think about the future? And it had to be a little bit normative in the sense that we said, this is how we would like it to be. And just to give you two examples of how difficult it is, to talk about this, just in the last few days, one news actually just reached us today, is we somewhere in the book, I think we talk about the changing stories about the different methods that cities and regions and nation states brought to bear on the pandemic at various times. And remember that in the beginning, there was this huge discrepancy between what Sweden did, who basically opened everything up and they didn't have any drastic measures, and other countries, like China, that completely shut everything down. It was totally unclear 2 years ago where this would go. And there is a passage in the book that says that Sweden sort of went back and forth on the numbers that we received out of that country. Today, the Swedish government released numbers that said that Sweden did, in fact, despite the fact that they had the most open policy of all nation states, did have the lowest excess death rate during the pandemic. So that's something one couldn't see coming. And this is an uncertainty to some degree. The other big story that keeps popping up every week is, of course, the question of the origin. So we had to tell a question of the origin, and our question of the origin is based on the socio-ecological theories and urban political ecology and landscape political ecology. And we, like others in the field, made the case that there is a systematic relationship between our spreading into the world as urban dwellers and using infrastructural networks and digging in mines and going into the forest, that has something to do with the processes that Harris outlined. But it might just be a lab leak. That's not this is not part of our research. So we're dependent on those kinds of things. So having said that, we are still in a moment of uncertainty, but let me give you some ideas about where we think our thinking has to go. And I'm becoming a little bit more urban and less health now. So I'll talk about what it might all mean for cities. So in this age of mega urbanization, city regions need to find effective methods and innovative methods to confront emerging infectious disease without relying on drastic top-down state measures that can be globally disruptive and often ineffective. And I'm not saying here that we need to be like Sweden, but clearly the more drastic measures didn't work, and we've done some follow-up research also to show that. This book that we are launching in a way today also wanted to provide an innovative framework of post-pandemic governance, which governance was really central to our analysis, which puts it into the hands of human organization. It's not about letting the virus roam or do its thing, herd immunity, these kinds of things, but it's about governance of cities and regions. It's about what we can do. And when we go forward, as we go forward now, we need to develop new ideas for more healthy, equitable, resilient, sustainable, and participatory metropolitan regions. And that also had required to provide an account of the specific role of urban governance in the overall structure of global health governance during the COVID-19 pandemic, including municipal response strategies, smart governance, innovations, and community response mechanisms. And that's really a far cry from when Harris and I first looked at SARS 20 years ago, because the United Nations always thought of itself, and it still is, an agglomeration of nation states. And only over the last 20 years, we've seen a softening of some of those positions, and we've seen how we have now, had a more assertive role in, assertive role in for cities and municipal government and regional governments in the process. So we're arguing as we look ahead that cities are now ubiquitous everywhere, and they're global in their reach. And we argue that institutions and actors of urban governance will be central to any future efforts that inform public health initiatives across political boundaries and geographical continents. We'll see how that goes, but that's sort of what we posit at this point. And that has to do with the fact that we are living in a changing urban world. We are very rapidly becoming a different planet that looks different, that feels different, it is inhabited differently. And in that changing world, there is an uncanny relationship between the spread of global urbanization and the spread of disease. That didn't go away with the end of this particular pandemic. And Harris already has taken us through these three very specific events that sort of we could learn from, both in terms of what it means for, epidemic or pandemic response, but also what it means for the building and governing of cities. So all of that is born out of this idea that every pandemic is as big as the world we imagine it to happen in. There have always been pandemics. There's always been, spread across continents. There's always been, most of the victims were in cities, but the urban world in which we now live has changed even since Harris and I looked at SARS. A tremendously different world, a world of much more connectivity and a different kind of connectivity than the one we saw when we just looked at the global city system. Part of it is, which we already heard about, this idea of the planet of slums, but it is also, and I just returned from Johannesburg, South Africa, and I've seen huge areas of that country that are developing neither in sort of the middle-class suburban extended city environments that we know in, for example, Anglo-America and Canada. But it also, is different from the informal settlements. Huge swaths of land that we've seen when Harris and I traveled to Kampala, Uganda, that we also, can study in South Africa, other places that are new, it's hard to say middle-class type of developments, but these are very substantial new urban forms that sometimes stretch 50, 100 kilometers long, and 1 million people live in those kinds of places that are neither urban nor are they rural. They're truly extended forms of urbanization. And then, of course, at home, these are images that we here in Toronto know very well. This is Brampton and the East End of Toronto, the typical two forms of extended urbanization that we see here that have also become the hotspots in the latest pandemic. What was new about this, and from which we now have to learn, is that for the first time, maybe if we take an exception with the 1918 so-called Spanish flu, this has been a shared planetary experience. But the difference between 1918 and 2020 was that now we live in a fully urbanized world, which we didn't in 1918. Only 10% of the human population was living in cities at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Now we're talking about almost 60% of the world's population living in something like a city. And the ubiquity and universality of the experience is written into the fabric of the urban landscape now. We cannot forget that in this generation, maybe next. And that is posing post-pandemic questions of vulnerability and resilience in urban life. And I'm leaning here on Chiara Campaneschi's research, who I think is listening, who I have had many conversations with, who is, of course, also a fellow here in the Dadaly Center and has been in conversation with all of us about these kinds of development. That's what we have to think about now: vulnerability, resilience in urban life post the pandemic. So I'm going to go a little faster now because I think we're running out of time. So when we think about post-pandemic life, we in the West, we thought it was all over when the vaccines arrived. But the vaccine rollout itself told us about the tremendous inequalities that led to terrible suffering in some over other communities in our extended urban form. And here we have, the example that everybody now knows is this map that was published a couple of years ago when the vaccine rollout was in full flight. Is again the area in which you at York are currently located. There's not a single pharmacy up there that had vaccinations going on, while in North Toronto and in the beaches and in the center of Toronto, there was a pharmacy at every street corner where you could get a vaccine. It's those kinds of strategic, systemic inequalities that we now have to turn to as we turn to the post-pandemic measures. We also have learned, and this is very important, that proactive approaches such as upstream preventive measures rather than downstream curative responses to health problems work better than reactive ones. It's really important to remember that, because we're now falling back again into this idea, oh, well, let's get another shot, let's get another vaccination, let's do this, let's cure it. If I have a mild case of COVID, I just take a few headache pills. That's not going to be a good way to think about, preparing for a potential next pandemic, because we need to think about the structural conditions under which we have analyzed in this book, this pandemic, the last pandemic, as the other pandemics we're talking about, have disseminated themselves through the city. And here's this famous Swiss cheese model of all the different obstacles you can put in the way. And what we are seeing now, and social media is full of it, is that now we're beginning to focus again on those slices of that Swiss cheese that deal with the kind of thing that I'm doing here, wearing a mask in the subway, which is, it's really true to the neoliberal idea that we have a personal responsibility to protect ourselves. And we're beginning already to forget that we need to now make the structural adjustments in cities, in public health, in the way we govern ourselves, in the way we provide protection for people at work, in the way in which we provide protection for precarious workers. All of those kinds of things now need to be thought about in a structural way, while we're now all fighting again over whether to wear a mask or not, which is, of course, an important slice of Swiss cheese to wear a mask, but it is not the only and by far not the most important. So one thing that will definitely be important in the next few years is the return of this debate about smart urbanism. They were the big winners, otherwise I couldn't speak to you from here. Zoom, any other kind of platform that enabled us to carry on teaching at the university, that allowed the economy to carry on, at least that part of the economy that was able to work from home, as they said it. Well, of course, most of the work was done elsewhere. It was just the terminal of the worker that was at a particular desk. But the networks of smart urbanism are now pushing themselves into the front of the new city. We have a changing regional economy with e-commerce, shadow infrastructures, and there are all kinds of underlying shifts in technology, environment, and culture that will change the city regions as we know them. And they have already changed them very rapidly. We all know that. We live our life now differently than we did even 3 years ago. So when we focus now on a post-pandemic strategy, how to do the things differently in cities, we have to focus on addressing the needs of those who bore the brunt of the COVID crisis this time, in order not to victimize them again, if something like that comes, and something will come, comes again. So, and that has many aspects, not just, ghettoized in the particular knowledge area of public health. It is about housing, transportation, jobs, governance and power, and of course the environment. Climate change didn't go away. So some cities have now created a pragmatic approach. This is an example of the city of Barcelona, a very progressive city, who have taken this into their hands to say, this has to be now part of our everyday politics. But we also need to look farther and be theoretical and methodological and think about the city after the pandemic in terms that allow us to think about organizing politics, organizing the sociality of the city differently, and the societal relationships with nature differently in cities. So we're following here, for example, Warren Magnuson's idea that the city has no clear boundaries, which was clearly shown in this pandemic. You can't say Steeles Avenue is the boundary of Toronto, and the virus won't travel across it. Of course, we don't have. So there is no clear boundary here between us in Toronto and Vaughan, just north of it. So we have to think differently also about how to governing these boundaryless cities, and in that process, see like a city. We have to have a perspective that comes from seeing like a city, not like seeing like a national government or a global organization, but seeing like a city in that recovery and seeing like a city in that preparedness. And we have to rely, as Harry's already mentioned, on how people organize themselves, how the communities organize themselves. We say here how the periphery organize themselves, that those hotspots in the northwest of Toronto and the southeast of Brampton, those hotspots also became really very productive centers of community innovation, how to organize vaccinations, how to organize public health, and all these kinds of things. And that these were often bottom-up experiences. So we have to liberate the potential of urban life itself. Urban life was under attack, under a mortal attack by this pandemic, a threatening crisis, which was happening around the world. So we're taking our cues here from, political philosophers and theorists like Ross Beveridge and Philip Koch, who just published this book with the same publisher that we have ours, in which they rethink democracy as something that has a power from below, that is not linked to the state, not even to the local state necessarily, but organizes itself in a bottom-up way. And we have to learn a lot as we move forward. And the last word of the book, and the last word that I'm going to say here, is to lean on my colleague Phil Harrison at WITS in Johannesburg, who we quote at the end of this book, who says, lessons of history need to be translated cautiously across temporal contexts, but that history does direct us to themes including the unpredictable course of most pandemics, the huge variability in the spatial patterning of epidemics, the significance of governance across all scales in shaping the course of epidemics, but also the effect of epidemics on shaping the continued evolution of governance, the economic and social consequences of epidemics, and the political consequences, and more. This is the task ahead. And I'm happy to say that the work that we just did in South Africa with Shu Fei-Ren, Hilary Birch, who's on this call, and Phil Harrison, is going to that direction. And all of us, like James indicated, are continuing to work in that way. So thanks very much.
Jay. We only have a few minutes, but I would invite people to pose or ask questions, but very briefly. And please raise your hand in the room if you want to do that, and also online, please raise your hand. And I would also encourage people online to turn on your camera so we can actually see you. But while people are gathering their thoughts to respond or to ask questions, I just want to say, I thought it was really wonderful how you described, Harris, the socio-political space and the flows, using three very distinct examples. I thought that was actually incredibly helpful to help people really visualize what it is that you're talking about, and to do it in a way that just really, really compelling. And Roger, your sort of lessons learned, if you will, or your extractions of at least some lessons learned and some kind of implications, I thought very, very prescient and very focused. I would like to, there's so many things that I could ask you about, but just in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask you about the following. In one of your slides, you talked about racism as a driver of the pandemic, and you were very precise in the description. You didn't actually refer to it verbally, but you said racism, not race. I thought that was, I mean, it's just on the surface a very simple kind of play on words, but it's not. There's a lot of complexity there. And I thought that was really powerful and profound. And then the second thing that I also thought was very powerful and profound was the emphasis on bottom-up, now on future initiative around bottom-up democratic organization within the city space, and not necessarily as a counter to the nation state, but as a almost a parallel kind of process. I thought that was really, really powerful. And then the third thing that I really want to ask you about is, you know, when we think about infectious disease from a medical public health perspective, we think about the two things that are really, really important. One is the transmissibility and the case fatality rate. And so when we think about, for example, SARS versus Ebola versus Marburg, for example, those two factors are, those two sort of descriptive epidemiologic factors are really, really core. Transmissibility and case fatality rate. And they really do, in many ways, predict the magnitude and the force, and I use that word very precisely, the force of response from the top in terms of efforts to contain, control, and mitigate an infectious disease. So with those three very quick comments, I just invite Harris and Roger to react to any one, some, or all.
Yeah, I can begin, Roger, if you want. Yeah, I mean, you know, you have a lot of colleagues, I'm sure, in the medical profession, and, you know, there's always this emphasis on the so-called risk factors. And the thing is, these risk factors are defined in terms of quantitative variables. So, for example, even race, like the amount of people of a certain race, ethnicity, or age. You know, all the epidemiological data is age standardized for various reasons, or sex, you know, male or female or whatever. But they leave out the context variable analog of that risk factor. So sexism, ageism, racism, right? Which is what we sociologists study, or social scientists in general study, right? These context variables. So these variables shouldn't be looked at in a vacuum. This is why you need to look at the social context. Like epidemiology, study of what? Right? Demos, people, study of people, not study of disease, study of people, right? So I think that context aspect has to be brought in more forcibly into medicine. About the, you know, R naught and the sort of like the mortality rate and infectivity rate, those are of course very important variables, and that's what the politicians and the response officials first go to. And I think during any emergency response, you need those sorts of statistics for sure, because you have urgent matters at hand about keeping the epidemic under control. But there's a difference between control and care, and Paul Farmer writes about this in terms of Ebola. You see, first the emphasis is on controlling things, but many of the people afflicted care about the care that they receive, right? So I do understand at the beginning, those sort of, you know, quantitative variables that you talk about, you know, the infectivity rate and the mortality rate are very important, you know, but after that certain stage, I think you do need to focus more on the context. That's what I would say.
No, I agree.
Roger?
Yeah, I have little to add to this particular point, but except for the fact that when we were in Johannesburg a couple of weeks ago, it was very clear that in Johannesburg, the people we talked to were much more aware of the particular interactions that even the variants of COVID, the variants of the virus from Delta to Omicron, how those variants made for different relationships between the governance of the city and the governance of community, and these were nuances often, but they made a difference. And so we have to be extremely aware of those kinds of things. Not every, it's not every virus will will mean that we have to stay 2 meters apart from one another, right? And not every virus propagates itself the way COVID has. The context is incredibly important as we move forward to make people more aware of the diversity of the kinds of health threats that might come our way. People my generation remember that when we were taught at a sexually most active age in the 1980s, in my generation, that all you needed was a condom to fight HIV/AIDS, which was both true and not true. But you can't fight all infectious diseases with a condom. There has to be an adaptability in the way these measures are being governed, and in the way, for example, something like sexual health is being talked about in society, like generation after generation. So these are the kinds of things we let fall down between SARS and COVID here in Toronto, for example. We had the experience, but we didn't learn too much from it. We didn't pay too much attention in those in-between years between 2003 and 2020 to what we could have done as an urban community to fend off what then COVID brought to our doorstep.
Thank you, Roger. So I don't want to dwell too much on transmissibility and case fatality rate, but I do want to say that I would like to get your reaction to the question of uncertainty. So in the early phases of COVID, there was so little was known scientifically about the virus and specifically about transmissibility and case fatality rate. And the responses, the public, nation-state governance responses and municipal localized public health responses were very much in relationship to changing science, right, and to changing knowledge. So can you somehow talk about the challenges of being in that dynamic space of changing knowledge, changing policy, changing practice, and what that might mean in urban settings, given the kind of issues that you've raised?
If I can begin, Roger. I mean, that dynamic as the pandemic was unfolding in the earlier parts was a very significant time, and in particular now because of the role of social media, because social media can amplify any message, across the board. Like, I've never seen a potential of a technology to do that. One, person could broadcast an inaccurate message to everyone, and that has an impact. And, it's a problem with misinformation. Disinformation was particularly problematic, as we saw with the pandemic, especially for that early phase that you're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of a public health response.
Absolutely. Roger, did you want to comment?
No, I think that's fine. Harris covered it. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. Well, we're at time. We're a little bit beyond. I'd just like to thank Harris and Roger again for their presentation. Just fantastic, and I'm really looking forward now to digging deep and diving deep into the book. You've given a great overview, and you've really given us just a whole new way of thinking about cities. And thinking about disease, and in this particular case, infectious disease in a global urbanizing context. So thank you so much for that. And I look forward to our future work and collaborations. And I see Chiara's on the line here, or is online, and she will certainly be involved over the next couple of years on some of the issues that emerge, or that have already emerged from Harris and and Roger's work and ideas that they presented today. So thank you so much, Roger and Harris. And with that, I'm just remind people that next week we have 2 seminars. One is with Harvey Skinner, former dean here at York, Dean of Health, and he's going to be presenting as part of his Global Health and Wellness Self-Care Lab, a seminar on developing your stress-busting action plan. That will be at 11 a.m. And then in the afternoon, we have a global health design seminar, case study with Bruce Mao and Jude Kong, professor of mathematics here at Jude is leading a major research program with me and others on artificial intelligence and pandemic and epidemic preparedness from a global health perspective. And Bruce Mao and his team will be offering some design perspectives on that initiative. So all are welcome. That's at 3 o'clock next week, same time, or same place, different time. And with that, we'll say goodbye.